Hi everyone. For my math landscape, I chose this image. The location of this image is Torreon Centro, which is where my dad grew up in Mexico. And so I really love this picture because it reminds me of travel, and it reminds me of photography, which I love, and it just brings so much sentiment and so many memories of, going out to Mexico and vacationing every like couple years. And so it just reminds me of a special place and somewhere where I can always think back and like, oh, my family's from there, and so it's a part of my dad and my life in a way. Um, and so for my first strategy, I included splitting. Um, and so for me, a memory, um, I remember being in my elementary classes, and so I remember when I was learning math, I always had trouble with math growing up. And so this one specific strategy, we had like the big numbers in like my second and third grade class, and we would create like these boxes, and we would kind of divide and put a different number in each box. And I think that really helped me like better understand like adding and like math and everything. Um, and so for the next strategy was skip counting. And for me, that one really brings a sort of a happy memory. I remember I was in like maybe third or fourth grade. I was in this RSP program. And so I would be pulled from class to go to this separate classroom with a smaller class size. And I only had like three or other four peers in the class. And so I remember that we would always count our like multiplying, do two, four, and six, and eight. And so this one kind of really makes me think of like, okay, I was kind of lucky to, be able to have more one-on-one with my teacher. And so this one, it really like kind of maybe sparked a little joy in like learning math and like, oh, like I really, got interested in wanting to learn more. And, and the next one for me is subsidizing. So I remember like late at night when I was little, my dad would always help me with math. Again, I always had trouble with math when I was in elementary school, so he would always help me with my math homework and everything. And so he would kind of like help me when he would get off work, he would always help me with my math and like counting. And so he would like put up like, oh, like five fingers, and he would like ask me like, oh, how many fingers am I holding? I would, either I would count one by one, but I would kind of already know like, oh, it's five. Um, and so, those memories kind of just bring back of like, knowing that my dad was always there to help me and everything, and kind of, be that person I could always count on. Like, oh, if I can't, you know, have a one-on-one with my teacher, I knew that when I'd get home, my dad would be there. Um, and for the next strategy is making tens. And so for that one, um, I remember in elementary school, maybe even older, maybe even middle school, we had like these, they were kind of like these connecting squares. They were kind of like the blue squares, and like it had like smaller little squares broken up. And so we had like the fives and the tens and the ones, and like the ones that were 100. And so those, we would use those to kind of like put together and like add up, okay, like, multiply, if that makes sense. But those are some that we use in like school, and that really helped me kind of understand it better. Also, because I was visually able to see like the numbers and like how it adds up to a certain number, because I've always been a visual learner, so for me it's always easier to be able to see what I'm learning, so that way I was able to grasp onto the material better. Um, and so for the next strategy on my math landscape, I have the one-to-ones correspondence. And for this one, I was at my preschool site, and so we were outdoors in the play yard, and so we had different centers set up outside. And so for one of the centers, we had these like little blocks. I don't remember specifically what they were. I think they were just like little like orange and red and blue blocks. And so we had some like tongs. And so this one little girl, she was stacking them, and so she called me over like, teacher, like, oh, like, can you like count with me, or can you play with me? And so of course I went over and I sat with her next to the table, and so she would stack them, and so she would, stack one by one, and so then would um we would count from the bottom, and we would go like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and like I would say like, wow, that's so many numbers. Like, do you think we could add more? And so she would add like another one, and so on and so on. And then we start from the bottom, like, okay, can we count them now? So to go from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then so she would kind of point at each one to kind of go as we went. And that was a really like, it just amazed me how fast she was learning how to count, um, and how she would count from the whole set that was, I guess, that she stacked. The next strategy that I included on my landscape was cardinality. And for this one, I remember I was doing my field experience, student teaching, for when I was in community college. And so we were indoors in the classroom. And so one of the little girls, we were sitting at a table, and she had like these animal blocks. And so there were like little bears and little ducks. And so she was separating them into different groups. And so she would put like 5 bears together, or she would put like 2 bears together, and she would kind of separate them by size too, in a way. And so she would be able to know that, oh, like there's this amount of uh like animal blocks in like the set. And so she asked me to come over, and so I would see and I would count with her. And she's like, oh, like there's 3 bears here, and then there's a total of 4 ducks over here. And so she kind of like started to group them by numbers, and but also by the animals and by the size too at the same time. Um, the next strategy that I included was one-to-one tagging. Um, and so for this one, I remember I was in a classroom, and there was this little boy, and he was playing with the blocks in the block area. And so I went over and asked him like, oh, what are we doing? Like, are we counting blocks? Are we putting blocks together? And so he was like, yeah. And so he like would separate, and we had different color blocks. So some blocks were blue, some were red, some were green, some were yellow. And so he would separate them. And so the way he would separate them, he would, count all the blue ones together. And so he would count, we had like at least, I think, like 7 or 8. And so we were like, oh, can we count them all? And so we counted. He would point out at each one, but he would miss one, so it kind of went a little bit from 1, and then he would go over to 2 and 3 and 4, and then he would kind of like he would skip one, so he missed one, but we would go back and we would still count one by one. Um, and for my last strategy, I have conversation of quantity. And so for this one, I watched a video from one of the student teaching where it was a child and he had like a row of quarters, and so he had 5 quarters close together, and then he had on the top 5 quarters but separated. And so the instructor in the video, she asked him like, oh, like, are both rows the same amount of quarters? And so he at first said, oh, like this one has more and then the bottom one had less. um and so he kind of would count them one by one, and then once he counted the bottom row and then the top row, he like realized, oh, like they're the same. And so the instructor said like, oh yeah, they're 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the bottom, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the top. um, and so that is my math landscape, and thank you everybody for listening.